We're talking through Daniel as we think together about when cultures collide. And as you know the story, Nebuchadnezzar leads the army. That they come into Judah and they take a bunch of Hebrew folks back with them to Babylon. And the point of doing so was to eradicate the Hebrew culture. It was to take these folks who could somehow benefit Babylon and brainwash them, teach them new skills, new language, new purpose, the whole thing. And when you do that, then you strengthen your culture because you get the best and the brightest people who can benefit you. And you weaken or hopefully destroy, basically, your enemy's culture. And so it's a kind of warfare that you and I are not used to, but it makes sense on some level. And that's what was happening. So they grabbed Daniel and some of the other Hebrew young men, hauled them off to Babylon. We saw where in chapter 1, they began the brainwashing, for lack of a better term. They began the reculturing process, taught them a new language, had them develop new skills, taught them their literature, all that stuff. In chapter 2, then, we read that King Nebuchadnezzar had a weird dream. And he wanted to know the meaning of the dream, but he didn't want to be tricked. So he didn't tell his wise men what the dream was. He said, if you're really all that, you tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me the interpretation of it. And of course, they couldn't do that. He even made the comment, or they did, that no man can do that, which is true. But Yahweh can do that. God can. So God did through Daniel. And it's the dream was that great big statue that represented the various kingdoms over time. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, and then it showed how the next kingdom would take over, and then the next, and then the next, and finally Rome, which would fall in on itself because of its own immorality and bad choices, etc. And then we come to chapter 3. And it's not surprising, really, that it starts a little bit abruptly with the phrase that King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. In chapter 2, he had dreamed about that great big image. Head of gold was him. Then the next one was the next part of the statue was made out of silver, and the next out of bronze, and the next out of iron. So I think, although Scripture doesn't fill this part in for us, this is my imagination. I'm always careful to tell you when I do that. In my imagination, my assumption is that he had that dream where he was the head of the statue, and the more he thought on that, I think he kind of decided, I don't want to just be the head of the statue, I want to be the statue. He didn't want to admit that other kingdoms would come after him. Therefore, he put together this statue, and the whole thing was gold, not just the head. Most likely, this is not a statue of solid gold. Just the logistics of that and the fact that there's not that much gold in all of Babylon, most likely. But it was a golden. The word that's used is an adjective, not a noun. Not that it's made out of pure gold, but it is a golden statue. Probably meaning that it was made out of clay or perhaps even wood and then covered in gold from head to toe. So it's a golden statue. So King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth was 6 cubits. Well, those aren't terms that we're familiar with. Those are different measures, but we would say it's 90 feet tall. 90 feet is pretty tall, and 9 feet wide. So that's a very tall but very narrow, in comparison, statue. It's kind of an odd dimensions there. Again, that's why I personally think that it was a statue of himself. It was a statue of a person. Those dimensions kind of fit a person better than they do one of the critters or one of the gods that he may have been following. So he builds this image of gold. Height 90 feet, breadth 9 feet. He set it up on the plain of Dura. Nobody knows really where that is. Different commentators like to argue about it. We don't really know where that is. It had to be close to the capital city of Babylon itself, in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So that's a weird list of 7 or 8 different governmental offices. And had we, if we had a more effective way to translate from ancient Aramaic, we might be able to make some closer parallels. But this is a weird language, and these are weird words. But you could kind of picture, if you will, an organizational chart. He's at the top. Nebuchadnezzar's at the top. Now, under him, there's going to be maybe a handful of, the word is sometimes translated princes, satraps. Under those satraps, then, they're going to have captains, or this translation uses the word prefects. So you got one guy who's over 5 guys. Each of those are over, 5, 10 guys, whatever it is. And then those oversee specific regions that have their specific governors. In addition to that organizational chart, within the government structure, you've also got counselors. These are the legal eagles, the lawyers, treasurers who are treasurers. That word we got figured out pretty close. Justices, law enforcers. These are the sheriffs and the police. And the magistrates. These are the judges that hear cases, etc., like that. So you've got this whole governmental structure, and in essence, he's saying, everybody who works for me, show up on this day. Not only are they going to show up because they get a government paycheck, but their presence also represents all of the people throughout the nation of Babylon. All of the Chaldean people. Because each one of those governmental regions represents a group of people. And so he symbolically has the entire nation in front of him, but specifically he has all of the government leaders gathered together for the dedication of the image that he set up. Verse 3, we go through those same offices again. The satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. What is that, like the fifth time in 4 verses now that we've heard Nebuchadnezzar set up? Nebuchadnezzar set up. Most of the time, when Scripture repeats something over and over, that's on purpose because it wants us to understand that there's a significant idea there. And the idea is this: Nebuchadnezzar did this on his own. This is not of God. This is not even for the people. This is Nebuchadnezzar set this up for himself. The emphasis is on he created a god, a false god, an idol. It's probably an idol that looks a lot like him. He set it up. And the emphasis that Daniel places on that as he tells the story over and over: Nebuchadnezzar set it up, Nebuchadnezzar set it up, Nebuchadnezzar set it up. So they stood before this idol. Verse 4, and the herald, you remember what that is. That's not a guy's name. That's the loudmouth for the kingdom. They didn't have, what's that? The town crier. Yeah, they didn't have PA systems back then. Didn't have a megaphone. The only way to be heard was for someone to train his voice, and it usually was a male. He would train his voice, learn to project, learn to control the air, all the stuff that they teach public speakers how to do, and then he would speak on behalf of the king in a way that everybody could hear. And so in verse 4, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." Who set it up? So you'll notice that he called in the government people, but he addresses the government people as all people of all nations, of all languages. So again, they represent. They're going to enforce this rule among everybody in the nation. And the rule is that when the polka band plays, you're going to fall down. He says, when you hear all these instruments, the horn, pipe, lyre, etc., you're to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. It is so interesting that they are required to worship. When government enforces religion, there's always going to be problems. And here you've got a government creating a religion. Now, at first, you and I might have thought he builds this idol or this statue that's prideful, but it's not really an idol until we read this verse. And it says, you will, when the music plays, you will fall on your knees and you will worship that idol. And that's where we come into some problems for the Hebrew people. Because every Hebrew, every Jew that has been taken from Judah has been resettled in Babylon. Every one of them is very familiar with the first commandment. Do you know the first commandment, or can you figure out what it might be? You'll have no other gods before me. Now, we need to make sure we understand that word before in the command. You'll have no other gods before me. That does not mean you can have other gods as long as they're not ranked above me. When the word before is used in that case, It is just like we use it when we say the defendant had to stand before the judge. In the presence of. God says, you will not have any other gods in my presence. Well, where is his presence?
Everywhere.
Exactly. The Jews knew this. The Hebrews are fully aware that they were not to worship any other gods, period. And yet now, as a part of this new culture, they're being told you must. You and I live in a culture that doesn't fit the teachings of Scripture. Right now, it's just annoying. But there will come a time when it's scary and dangerous. And we want to consider, how do you live when cultures collide? How do we respond? We need to respond appropriately now when it's just a lot of noise. But when it actually becomes painful persecution, we need to be ready for that. Because the cultures will collide, they already do. But that collision will take on a new experience at some point along the way. So as we look through the rest of the chapter, I'm going to challenge us to think about a faith that is strong enough to help us get through that culture collision. And that kind of faith is so strong that it doesn't even ask for miracles. Now that sounds backwards. Let me show you as we go through the text. I'll show you what I mean. A faith that asks no miracles. So we pick it up again in verse 4. He said, the herald said, when the band plays, you will worship the golden idol. Verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the polka band, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down, worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Again, remember who set it up. He continues to enforce that or reinforce that. Notice also in that last verse that we read, all the peoples, nations, languages. Everybody's doing it. This is how culture puts pressure. This is how you are controlled. This is how you're influenced because of the desire to fit in with the world around you. So as the world changes, it tries to change us as well. And so we say, well, everybody's doing it. By the way, that's not just a teenage struggle. You don't really outgrow peer pressure. Verse 8, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward, maliciously accused the Jews. Now, what we call the nation of Babylon really is a nation of people who are called the Chaldeans. Babylon was like the capital, and so we will refer to the nation as Babylon. The people in that part of the world were Chaldeans. Over time, however, by the time Nebuchadnezzar came into rule, most of the people used the name Babylonian. Those who continued to use and only use the word Chaldeans did so to signify that they were holding on to the old paths, the old way of thinking, and they therefore were considered the wise men, the astrologers, the advisors in the king's council. Does that make sense? That's what that word is. So in Nebuchadnezzar's stories, when you see the word, they're referring to people in the royal court who advise him. And in verse 8, when it says there were certain Chaldeans who came forward and maliciously accused the Jews, we begin to realize that there was a subplot. There was a story behind the story. How did old King Nebi come up with this idea? I'm going to build this big image, and we're going to play a song, and you're going to kneel down. He came up with this image most likely because his spiritual advisors gave him that idea. And now it is those same spiritual advisors who are coming to be tattletales. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over here, they're not playing ball. I think that was their plan all along. You see, these were foreigners, these were Jews who were brought into the royal court and given positions of respect and responsibility. The Chaldeans don't like that, because now here are these foreigners who are taking away our importance. Now we're not needed quite so much anymore. So let's figure out a way to bump them off. Let's get the king to build this big old thing. Let's play the fiddle and drum and whatever and fall down. And we know they won't do it. I think the whole thing is set up. Not only because of the little hints that we see in those verses, but because the very same kind of thing happens to Daniel later, where the scripture is very clear that they set him up. So with all those little hints and minor evidence put together, I argue that the Chaldeans were behind this thing from the beginning.
Why is he spared this event? Even though, because he is one of the four. And I know he's above them, and they're part of his group.
Yeah.
Why is he spared?
That's a great question. And the short answer is, we don't know.
He was out of town that week.
That is actually one of the arguments.
He was on vacation.
David, it's so funny because as I read through and prepare, on a lot of times as I'm reading through and preparing for Wednesday, I think David's going to ask me that. And so I actually did some research, and we don't know. One guy says that he was probably out of town. Another guy says that that he had a different role than these three, although Scripture doesn't technically support that either. Somebody else said he may have been sick at the time, and everybody's just grasping at straws trying to figure it out. We don't know.
Well, he did interpret the Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, so maybe he expected he might need him another time.
Well, because he did that in chapter 2, he is raised to a very high level in the court. And so it could be that the Chaldeans know they better not mess with him. These other three dudes over here, you know, they're kind of equal or lower in the ranking than these Chaldeans. So that would be my guess, that in chapter 2, Daniel was raised way up here, and these three guys are down here.
Joseph was not subject to some of the same things that happened to foreigners. When
Exactly.
Because he was raised up by Pharaoh, and to Gwen's point, Pharaoh needed him.
Right.
And if he got rid of him, then who was going to be his fall guy?
Right. Now we're in trouble. Later on, when they try to bump off Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar really struggles with that because he doesn't want to lose Daniel. So, yeah, I think probably at this point they just didn't even try to bring that up because they knew he was off limits. That would be my guess.
He had some time between interpretation of the dream and building the statue, right? I mean, it's going to take a while to build a statue.
Yes, and how much time? One guy said one guy said 20 years. And so I studied to try to figure out how he came up with that, and he could not defend his point. So I'm throwing that out, and I'm thinking it's not terribly long, but you're right, it would take a while to organize this, to have something built, have something set up, to get all the people together. I do think that the statue he built in chapter 3 is because of what he remembered from his dream in chapter 2. But that dream would have been so dramatic, he would remember it for many, many years. So I don't know how much time between chapter 2 and chapter 3. All right, this is fun, isn't it? Verse 8.
One other thing.
Yes.
So to your point, Nebuchadnezzar only was king 43 years. It says here
Okay.
his reign.
Yeah.
His reign was from 605 to 562. So it's only 43 years. So I'm guessing that they got on building that thing pretty quick. I don't think they let the grass grow very long before they had to start building.
Right. Yeah, I really don't know. We remember the dream happened early in his reign. I think it said second or third year of his reign he had this weird dream. So it was early, but yeah, it couldn't have been real long before the second event. So again, verse 8, Chaldeans come forward, maliciously accuse the Jews. Verse 9, they declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever." That's just the normal greeting you would expect. That's just how you say, "Hey king, listen up." Verse 10, "You, O king, have made a decree." And then they remind him of what the decree was. "Every man who hears the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, hymn, blah, 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 shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon." You see how they describe the Jews? You put them in these positions where they get to rule over the province of Babylon. They're exaggerating, and they're making their point. We don't like these guys. You put them in the position of power and authority, and that's supposed to be our power and authority. And then they point out exactly who they're talking about. These Jews you appointed, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, you and I learned that that's not the names their mamas gave them, right? That's the names that the Babylonians gave them, which is why we see those names here. When you see Daniel using those names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you'll notice that they're tied to something happening within the Babylonian government. There are times when he refers to them with their real names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But those times are when he is reflecting from a Hebraic or godly point of view. When he tells the story of how they're interacting with Babylon, he uses the Babylonian names. "These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And like we mentioned earlier, multitude of gods. You'll notice that reference. They don't serve your gods or worship the golden image. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" It is as if he is trying to give them one last chance. Guys, is this true? Let's see if we can fix this. All right, let's see if we can avoid having a Hebrew barbecue. We don't really want to do this. Let's see if we can figure out a way around this. 15. "Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the polka band and fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? He gives them one last chance. Guys, this is it. Right now, when the music plays, if you'll bow down, all good. But if not, he puffs out his chest, puts his chin up. What little g God out there could stop me? What God could take you out of my hand? Do you see how powerful I am? I've got a 90-foot golden image. What God could stop me? It's so interesting in Old Testament stories when pagan leaders accidentally speak the truth or ask questions that come back around. He's about to find out what God can handle him and his issues. 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. I love it. They said, "Dude, we don't have to defend ourselves to you. You're not our daddy." What they're saying is, we're not going to answer to the culture that demands that we forsake our faith. There are times when they obey the king. And in almost every situation, they are respectful. But they do not think that it's their responsibility to defend themselves or answer the culture that is forcing them to forsake their faith. And because of that, we learn from these guys that strong faith is demonstrated by actions and not just words. They said, O king, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Then look at verse 17. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. King, if you want to throw us in the fire, you go on ahead and do it. We're not going to answer to you because we answer to him. And the God that we answer to is able. Friends, I think that's where faith begins. When we finally are able to confess, my God is able. There's not much faith unless you have a God who's able. Unfortunately, I think maybe too many of us stop there in our faith development. My God is able. Well, that's cool, but is there anything more? For them, there was something more. They said in verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand. Nebuchadnezzar said, what God could take you out of my hand? And they said, our God can, and he will. It's one thing to believe he's able. It's another step of faith, a deeper faith, to believe not only that he's able, but that he will act in our lives. It takes a lot of faith to say, my God can do this. It takes a lot more faith to say, not only can he, but I believe he will. But then I want to suggest to you that there's even a deeper faith. That's a harder faith. In verse 18, but if not, Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. One level of faith says, my God is able. A deeper faith says, not only is he able, but he will do it. Even a deeper faith says, but if he chooses not to, I am still going to believe him. Now, that's not what the guy on TV tells you. The guy on TV tells you if you have enough faith and send him enough money, God will do whatever you want him to do.
You know, this makes me think about that girl in Columbine when she was confronted and the boys told her to denounce God and she didn't. They shot her and killed her. But she had enough faith that she would not denounce Christ her Savior. And we know the rest of the story. But that's an amazing.
Absolutely.
If they had just stopped and said, he can rescue us and I know he will, and that was the end, that is painting God in a corner and not allowing God's will to be done in our lives. And we don't always know what that will is.
Yes. Thank you for saying that, for pointing that out. That's exactly right. Sometimes we think because we have enough faith, we now can control God. We put him in a box, like you say. Paint him in a corner, I think was your, yeah. But God is so much bigger than our understanding that sometimes he says no. We can believe for a miracle. I know my God can do miracles. And I actually think he's going to do this miracle. But if he chooses no, I'm still going to believe him and serve him and follow him. It's a faith that asks no miracles. Strong faith is demonstrated by our actions and not just our words. So they said, we believe, but we're not going to bow down to your idol no matter what happens. There's a difference between belief and faith. They had a faith that didn't even require a miracle. Belief is accepting certain facts as truth. Right? We can list our beliefs. They're facts that we accept are true. But faith is living a life that depends on those facts. It's the difference between believing the airplane can fly and buying a ticket and getting your boarding pass, getting on board.
I think part of it's accepting his will for us, too.
Good. Yeah. Is it James that says, don't say that tomorrow I'm going to go to such and such a town. Say that if the Lord wills, I'll be in such and such a town tomorrow, kind of a thing. Yeah. There's one of the other things that we find as we look at these guys' example, that difference between action and words, the difference between belief and faith. There's a difference between religion and faith as well. Christianity that is talked about is religion. Christianity that's lived out is faith. And so these guys did not just talk their religion. They lived out their faith. They put their lives on the line. They said, we believe he can do it. We think he's going to do it. But if he doesn't, baby, we'll burn because we are not going to bow down.
Is this a bridge too far? When Peter denied Christ, but yet he forgave him.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, here's a case where they didn't deny God, but Peter did.
Yeah.
Times.
Yeah, I did.
because he was just scared.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then as soon as all that happened, he went out and wished he hadn't.
But that's a real, when I think about that, here's these guys know they're getting ready to get thrown in the furnace, and they didn't.
Yeah,
Didn't say they weren't scared.
yeah.
Oh, no, I know, but they
No, that's a good point.
were able to control their fear,
Right.
but, or Peter, though, couldn't.
Well, also Christ had told him he was going to do it. You know, he said, look, you're going to deny me. Your fear will overcome you.
Yeah,
And I think it happens to everyone occasionally.
yeah. Our goal is to have that faith that is strong enough that it directs our lives and doesn't depend on the miracles, that takes us beyond religion. Even in 1 Samuel, Samuel's appointing Saul as king, and God says, tell Saul to wipe out those Amalekites over there, but I mean wipe them out. I don't want you to save any of their stuff because they're pagan, and we're not going to let that pollute who we are. So wipe all of it out. So Saul goes over there and he wipes out the people, but then he picks and chooses. You know, that lamb, he's got a blemish. We'll let him go, but that's a pretty lamb over there. We're going to keep that one. And he picked out the stuff that he thought looked good. And so when he kind of picked that stuff out, Samuel says, dude, you disobeyed God. And Saul comes back with, yeah, but we kept all this nice stuff so we could make sacrifices with it. And Samuel says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Is he going to be happy with those critters that you protected and saved, or would he be happier if you had obeyed him to begin with? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to listen than the fat of rams. The idea that I want to stress to us tonight is that faith that asks no miracles is deeper than religion. It goes past just saying the right thing and showing up at the right time and going through the right motions. It actually affects who we are, it affects our lives to the point that we obey, and that obedience is more important than the religious sacrificial activity. So strong faith is demonstrated by actions and not just words. And strong faith does not depend on miracles, as we saw in verse 17 and 18 primarily. He's able. I think he will. If he doesn't, I'm still going to believe. Scratched on the walls of one of the Nazi prison camps were found these words: I believe in the sun, even when it does not shine. I believe in love, even when it is not expressed. And I believe in God, even when He is silent. Strong faith does not depend on miracles. I believe in Him, even if He says no, even if He's silent. I put my faith, I depend on who He is. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. By the way, is it Habakkuk or Habakkuk? They did a study, and they figured out that there is a correlation between how people pronounce that name and personal attractiveness. The best looking people say Habakkuk. So let's look at Habakkuk chapter 3. Though the fig tree should not blossom, or fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no fruit, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stalls, there's no wheat in the field, there's no cattle on the ranch, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. No matter what my circumstances are, my faith is secure. I trust in God even when He's silent. And we can do that because of Hebrews. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Our faith is not dependent upon our circumstances. We don't believe because God is doing the right things for us. We believe because God is God. Even if the circumstances don't work out, we still trust Him. You remember Polar Express? Remember the conductor? The conductor on Polar Express taught us something. He said, seeing is believing. But sometimes the most real things in the world are the things we can't see. I believe even when my circumstances don't support that belief. We're going to need that as cultures collide. We got to move quickly. Verse 19 is going to help us catch on to the fact that strong faith won't make you popular. When cultures collide, you're going to need strong faith, but know that strong faith is not going to make you popular. 19, Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. I don't know why. That just doesn't, it's just so silly. The furnace is hot enough already to melt metal. That's the purpose of the furnace. It was, what's the word, smelting? So there would be a hole at the top of this thing so it could ventilate, but also that's where they would drop some kind of pot container holding the ore. And it gets down in the fire, and because of the fire, it separates the junk from the metal, and then there's probably a door on the side where they can pull that out from the bottom, kind of a thing. And it's already hot enough to melt. I mean, a human body is not going to react differently at this degree than it is 7 times hotter. He was just mad. He was throwing a fit. And so he said, I want this thing to be hot. He 7 times hotter, verse 20, he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. He goes through the list of the clothes they were wearing to make a point, because a little bit later when they come out, they got them same clothes. 22, because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. It was so hot that it burned up the bad guys that were throwing them in. But what we're about to find out is that God was with the Hebrews and not the guys that were carrying this out. Unbelievers don't understand our courage and our dedication. As our cultures collide, one of the reasons that folks are not going to understand us is because our courage, our dedication is based on a faith that non-believers just don't have. They can't relate to it. So these Hebrews said, no, we're not going to. Tie us up, do what you got to do, throw us in the barbecue pit, It's not going to change anything. In John chapter 15, Jesus reminds his disciples, he reminds us, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, because I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And they threw these guys in the fiery furnace. Hated, they were not popular. Verse 24, King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. The appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Strong faith trusts in the presence of Christ. They put 3 men in. When old Nebi looked in there, he saw 4. And there's a lot of fun debate. Who is the 4th? Is it an angel? The phrase, sons of God, is used in the Old Testament to refer to those created beings who represent God, angels. It could also be, we see in other stories in the Old Testament, we do see what we call the pre-incarnate Christ, that Jesus appears on the earth even before he was born in Bethlehem. We could argue, except that it's time to go so you can get your kids. We could argue back and forth, an angel or Christ or some other being. But that argument would just be fun, wouldn't get us anywhere beyond the most important point, and that is that person represented the presence of God Almighty. It is Jesus pre-incarnate or a messenger of God. The point is God was with them, even in the midst of the fire. We can always be assured of God's presence through the fire. Isaiah 43, when you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. Through the rivers, they'll not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you'll not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. You and I are going to go through the fire. We're going to go through the flood. You've heard me say it before, and you've heard others say it before. It's not original. If you're not going through a storm right now, it's because you just got through a storm or the storm's brewing. This is our life. You're going to go through hard times, but you don't have to go through the hard times alone. David says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why?
Thou art with me.
Thou art with me. Strong faith trusts in the presence of Christ. The last paragraph we don't have time for. The point is, they brought them out of the fire, and the only thing that burned was the ropes that held their hands. They were set free. All those clothes that they talked about earlier, they weren't singed at all, and they didn't even smell like smoke. It's in there. Isn't that amazing?